Okay, well, thank you guys for joining us today. This webinar is brought to you by VABF, the Virginia Association for Biological Farming. Please join our network of organic and sustainable farmers and gardeners by becoming a member today. You can sign up on our website, vabf.org. And today we are bringing you a webinar with Cedric, Shannon, and his wife, Sarah, who own Weathertop Farm. The webinar is entitled Soil Health from the Grazer's Perspective. Cedric and Shannon raise sheep, cows, hogs, layers, broilers, turkeys, and some ducks. The animals all get rotated through pastures and improve and build the soil, which is the true foundation of their operation. Cedric also has a podcast called Can Your Beans Do That? And writes on medium.com under the handle Farmer Sledge. And their website is weathertopfarm.com. And on their website, you can take a tour of the operation as well as find links to Cedric's writings and podcast. And this webinar will also be included on their website as well. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll get started.
All right, welcome everybody. Hopefully you're here for soil health from the grazer's perspective, and I'm Cedric. Got a lot to cover today, and I get a little frustrated with the webinar format just because I can't read the room very well. So I figured that maybe one way to deal with that a little bit, make sure everyone's tracking, would be I'm just gonna thinking of my presentation in 3 sections. And I'd like to have some question and answer going on after each of those sections. So the first section, I'll just do very basic principles, go through that really quickly. I think most people are going to be on board there, but we'll make sure everyone is tracking. We'll stop for some Q&A. That can all be written. And then we'll go through it again through rotational grazing perspective. And then again, I'll go through questions there. And then after we do like ramifications, implications, we'll do another question and answer. And I would like to be able to open that up so people could raise their hand and actually ask questions if they want as well. Because I know when I attend these webinars, sometimes I have a long question and I don't necessarily want to write it all out. So I do want to get some good discussion going. I may even say some controversial things. So hopefully I'll get some pushback. So we'll stop a couple times throughout, and then we'll have question and answers at the end. So great. Slides aren't working. They were working. There we go. Okay. So just a quick overview, so we get an idea of what we do. Lindsay already said some of the things. We have multiple species, right? And everything is rotationally grazed. So we have about 50 ewes. We are growing our cattle operation. We sell usually over 120 hogs. We do up to 6,000 of the meat birds, the broilers. We usually have about 1,000 or more layers that are in some stage of their lives and production. And we do about 500 turkeys. And then we do usually a couple hundred ducks. So multiple species, and everything is rotated through the pasture. And here I chose this picture. I like this picture a lot because you can see this is just a group of lambs here, and you can kind of see where they've been. They started up sort of top center here. They worked their way down to the right. Now they've come over here, and this gives a good example. I chose this picture. Well, because you can see what they ate the day before, and then you can see what the piece that they've been giving that day there, the fresh piece of pasture. So just to give you an idea, I don't want to get too much into the how-tos, but just so you have an idea, when you say rotational grazing, we kind of do these corridors with this electric netting. We don't really have perimeter fences, but we do corridors, and then we have these cross fences, which we gauge how much we're going to give them. And so we will move this cross fence, and we give them something every day. And then twice a week, we'll move the stuff behind. So we've got the house there, and we've got a water there, and that'll get moved, and we move the back fence. So one of the major principles of rotational grazing, one of the key aspects is don't let them eat the regrowth right away. So they eat a lot of the biomass and they leave some, and then you leave it intact enough so that it can regrow back, and then you keep them off that regrowth, and then you're going to have a lot of get a lot of biomass going that way. So everything is, well, some things are done with a daily sort of thing. So the sheep, the broilers, the turkeys, the ducks, they all get something every day, and then the back fence gets moved twice a week. Things like the hogs or the layers, they just basically the whole thing gets moved twice a week. But you get the idea that we're moving through these pastures and we're controlling the animals in which way they go. So I'm going to spend the first section we're going to do, I should explain my 3 sections. I'm going to go through the principles of Nrcs soil. I'm going to run through them real quick at the first run. And then we're going to stop, making sure everyone's tracking, make sure everyone's following. And then we're going to run them through again. And this is going to be from the grazer's perspective. We'll stop for questions again. And then the third point will be ramifications and implications. So let's get going here. So we've got the 5 principles of Nrcs, and this is basically for crops. So Nrcs is a government program that its roots are back all the way to the Dust Bowl, when we have just plowed everything up. We were losing all our soil, and we were in apocalyptic crisis mode, right? So they're like, we got to do something to save our soil, and so the focus began to be mitigating damage, right? How do we cause the least amount of harm when we're, raising our crops and raising our animals and raising all what we do? We got to make sure we don't lose soil, because we don't ever want to have this sort of apocalyptic crisis of just our soil just disappearing in the wind, right? So today we're still losing. I think I've seen statistics like 6 billion metric tons of soil a year. So it's still an issue, and we'll still have a long way to go to work on preserving and mitigating this damage and keeping our soils in place. So the first principle that Nrcs establishes is armor, right? This is just a very primitive mitigation. This is just very mechanical, very physical, right? So you've harvested whatever you're harvesting, or you've just plowed, get something on that bare ground, right? And this is just purely in a mechanical way. So if you've got raindrops falling down on this, it's like little explosions. There's a lot of velocity coming down with these raindrops. Explodes that water. You start accumulating that water from a rainfall, and then it can just pick that dirt up and erode it all down and wash it on down to the rivers. So you cover it, and this can be anything, right, from the mulch to black plastic to anything to cover the ground to protect it. So there's water damage. There's also temperature damage, right? So it's a shield, and you're protecting it from the heat of the sun hitting directly on the soil, right? And it's because plants, they really need there's an optimum temperature for them to grow, and as soon as things get too hot or too cold, you just start losing your you start losing your optimum window for growth. So and that's both for during the heat, and also can have some effect during the cold. So yeah, continual life plants. Like, if you know Nrcs principles, you may realize that I have switched this up a little bit, but I do this for a reason, because I wanted to compare and contrast, right? So we have the idea of what this armor is. There's a sense that plants are basically continuing this sort of mechanical, physical aspect of it. So we have a structural scaffold. So not only do you have your shield above, where you have your armor, so you're basically your leaves of your plants are the shield protecting both from water, and you're also protecting for temperature. But now you've got the roots there, and there's a physical scaffold that's holding the aggregates of the dirt there, and so that when you get a big rainfall and stuff, it's not washing away the soil. So there's a very physical part of it. Very mechanical part of it. But there's also, we have this focus on soil on the top part. So we focus on armor, we're focusing on the physical. I want to try to, delve a little deeper go into a little bit more complex. So I was a philosophy major. I'm really into general systems thinking. So I think at this level, and I think of things in terms of complex systems, and I definitely want to get that across. I certainly don't want to get into any sort of concepts that aren't at all accessible. I want this to be very accessible to everybody. So part of that's part of the question and answer here. Make sure everybody's tracking. But so there is an aspect where things are very mechanical and very straightforward, but there's also an aspect where things are very complex and they're into complex systems. And so we tend to think mostly in that mechanical, mostly in that paradigm of mechanical. So we think usually about the top layer of soil. So if you're a gardener or maybe you're growing crops or whatever, you know, we think, oh, let's put a bunch of manure, let's put some compost, maybe green manure, work all this in, and we think that we're building soil. Well, you know, there's nothing wrong with doing that. Great, you put your compost or your manure on top, and that top stratosphere is it's going to love you for that, but very little of that is actually going to go to the plant. Mostly you're just feeding this ecosystem that's on that top stratosphere of bacteria, microbes. They're going to love you for it, and they're going to devour it. And most of that's just that carbon that's in there is actually going to be returned to the atmosphere in carbon dioxide or methane, and nothing wrong there, but you haven't built soil, right? You're not actually making humus, and you're in no way are you like sequestering carbon or anything like that, right? So it goes much deeper than that. And well, first I need a shout out to Dr. Christine Jones, and she's a soil biologist from Australia, and she's kind of taught me a lot, kind of got me to change my paradigm and understand things a little better. She does have a website, not the most sleek website, but Amazing Carbon basically is a bunch of links to all her articles. But I've oftentimes Googled her and found her on YouTube, and she does a lot of keynote speaking at conferences about soil. But she has a really apt metaphor. It's I don't know why, there it is, liquid carbon pathway. Right, so this is what she calls plants, and this was in the context of carbon, right? So she, I don't know what's going on. Okay, liquid carbon pathway. So basically, there's this idea that there's carbon, and there's carbon as a gas form, and in order to sort of get to build humus, and in order to sequester carbon, we got to get that carbon in a solid form down beneath the surface, right? And that happens at the roots. So in a sense, you've got the plants and they're a liquid carbon pathway. So essentially when you take carbon dioxide and you get photosynthesis, you're getting energy from the sun and you mix it with water. And anytime you're putting carbon and hydrogen and oxygen together, that's basically a sugar, right? And so that sugar is kind of in this syrupy form, and it works its way down and it goes out the roots, and then it exchanges that sugar to like with the microbes or the bacteria, it might be with a mycorrhizal network, right? So you've got this pathway of getting the carbon down to the roots. And if there's anything to take from Dr. Christine Jones or from my talk here, what we get at is that, shoot, I don't know why these aren't working. Okay, the nexus of soil building occurs through the interactions in the rhizosphere. Right? So if we want to talk about soil building, it's not about adding ingredients, right? It's not about getting your compost in. It's not about putting the right ingredients, whether you're nutrients, macronutrients, micronutrients. Soil is built, humus is built by interactions. And these interactions, the important ones to build this, are happening at the roots, right? So it's a very different focus than just adding your ingredients, because you've got all these, so when bacteria are eating the carbon or eating the nutrients and exchanging them, they're making a slime, right? Because they have to have a wet environment to function. If you've got the mycorrhizal network coming in, they're actually, I think they make something called glomalin, right? And these things are part of what holds the humus together. They're part of what, all these interactions and these exchanges that are going on between these things, between the roots and between all the critters and all the microbes and all the fungi down there, those are the interactions. That's what makes soil. So mycorrhizal network, yeah, I made a reference. We'll circle back all around to this and we'll get into these things a little deeper. But mycorrhizal network, if anyone doesn't know, I expect most of you do, but this is just a fungus that inserts itself into the roots of the plants. And in a sense, it can extend the reach of plant roots like 10-fold or 20-fold, you know, and it's wild because it'll go out there and it can do all its alchemy, but it can't get carbon. These kinds of fungus can't get carbon except through the roots of the plants. So they get all these nutrients, you know, maybe 20 feet away, and they bring them through the hyphae, and they bring them through the network, and then they exchange, and they get the phosphorus, or they get the nitrogen, or they get the whatever they want to need to give. They give that to the plant, and the plant is giving back carbon in exchange for them. So there's all this economic exchange, all these interactions down there, and as they all come to a whole, that's what creates soil. So if we want to have the soil intact, we want these interactions, right? Nrcs says we have to have minimal disturbance. We have to mitigate the damage we do there, right? So the very obvious and very mechanical, very first and foremost is plowing. Plowing, there's nothing as destructive to an ecosystem as plowing, right? It's just a physical disruption. You take your pasture or whatever's there and you just work the ground and you flip it all over, and it's like it's a violent regime change, right? So you've taken all the structures, you've broken all those interactions, and you start the whole thing over from scratch. You get yourself a clean slate, you get rid of all the weeds, and then you can plant whatever you want. And whereas it's necessary and for us to get our crops in and whatnot, we have to realize that it's extraordinarily damaging to the systems, especially if we're concerned about building soil. So Nrcs is pleading for everyone to do minimal amount of plowing. You know, maybe you just plow once at the beginning and then the rest you kind of cultivate just the top. They're advocating for no-till, anything we can do to do minimal disturbance in terms of plowing, because that's just a physical, it breaks all the structure, it breaks everything down so that we have, right? And if you don't get your armor right after either you've plowed or you've just, you know, turned all this over and a big rain comes, it's going to wash it all away unless you got your armor or you can get some plants growing right away. So there's that. There's the mechanical. There's the very physical component of plowing. There's also the chemical, right? And so here we have I put killers and fast food. So killers basically are all your pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, right? So they're saying, please, let's use minimal amount of these, right? Because 99% of the animals out there, 99% of the viruses, 99% of the bacteria and all this, they're beneficial and they're helpful, right? And then we have that 1% that attacks attacks our plants and whatnot. We apply these killers, it's not just going to kill. There's a lot of collateral damage, so to speak, right? So they're pleading for minimal amount of the killers. They also, and to their credit, they are saying, let's not give them too much fertilizer or ingredients or nutrients. I call this fast food. And this is both applicable for synthetic or organic. So basically, the way they put it is like an over application of nutrients is disruptive to the soil food web functions, right? And we'll get back into this, but basically, if we start adding all these things, we're adding ingredients, the interactions start slowing down and we have less and less interactions. We actually have less and less soil building. So minimal disturbance. The next one is plant diversity, right? For a long time, I was like, well, why, how can we explain why plant diversity is so important? If you begin to understand things aren't about ingredients, but things are about interactions, then suddenly you understand that the more players you have, the more interactions you get, right? And bacteria are very much like this. If anyone listened to Mark Schoenbach a few weeks ago, he talked about the guild of bacteria that comes with each plant, right? And each root and each ecosystem. So each one's got their group of bacteria that comes along with them. And bacteria are very strange. They can hang around there and they don't get activated until there's a certain threshold of them, right? So they need one of just their own species. They need a certain amount to reach a threshold of quantity, and then suddenly they have the signal and they get activated. They also do this in terms of the guilds, right? So they also do it to interspecies of the bacteria. They wait for there's enough signals going on from the different bacteria. And when you get that certain threshold, they get activated. So diversity becomes essential to activate these things, to activate the interactions, to activate the bacteria, the microbe, even if you still got some fungi there, even to activate them. And the more activations we get there, the more interactions we get, the more possibilities for doing soil. And then last but not least is livestock integration. And this is great because 5-6 years ago, this wasn't there, right? And this has really gotten on the radar lately. And let me my page here. Yeah, so it's been great to see Nrcs has worked this in. I remember talking with Mark back 5 years ago at a meeting, and he was talking about soil building and carbon sequestration. And I said, well, what about bringing the ruminants in? And he's like, well, I don't really know much about that. So now it's on his radar. It's great to hear him talking about it in his presentation. It's on everybody's radar now, and so I think that's great. Basically, they help with minimal disturbance, right? So if you got livestock integration from a crop point of view, and right, so much of plowing has to do with weeding. So much of chemicals have to do with weeding. So are the nutrients. Well, let me back up. It doesn't have to do with weeding, but the animals can address these issues, right? So if you've just harvested your seeds, so either your wheat or your corn or whatever, or you harvested your fruit, right? And you have your plant left and you have your leaves and you have your stalks, whatever, you can bring in your ruminants there and they're going to eat the rest of the stuff, right? So they're going to clean it up, right? And they're going to, not only are they going to clean it up and get the weeds out of there, but they're also going to drop some fertilization down, right? They're going to drop some manure, which is extra bonus, right? And we know that this is an appropriate amount of application here because that's been happening for eons and eons. So, yeah, we'll spiral around and come back to these again, but this would be a good opportunity to make sure that if we've got any questions or anything. Lindsay, I haven't seen about the questions and answers.
I don't see any questions yet.
Okay. I'm having a hard time on my screen seeing everything is there chats or anything?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, great. So we'll move on. Hopefully everyone is tracking well, right? So permaculture, right? So what do we think of when we think of permaculture? If you ask the typical person what's going on with permaculture, the image in their mind is going to be like a garden, right? They're going to say maybe you have an orchard there and you have some perennials like blueberries, whatnot, and then hopefully you have a diversity of species within your annuals. So I chose this picture here. This is closest thing I could find that had to do like with the Three Sisters, right? So a lot of the indigenous groups, they had the corn stalk going up, and then they had the beans, the legumes, and that would climb the stalk of the corn. And then at the bottom, we've got the squash, and that's providing shade and shelter and armor down at the bottom, right? And this is great. You got your diversity, and you've got you've got a diversity of species, and probably in your garden you're having some trees and some more permaculture and stuff. But as great as that is, in a certain sense, from a pasture point of view, we kind of scratch our heads, the rotational grazers, say, well, that's great, but what about our pasture, right? So here's a picture of one of our pastures, one of our fields here, and we meet all the criteria of the Nrcs, right? So we're not even worried about armor at this point because we always have we always have plants on. This is the ultimate perennial. This is the ultimate permaculture, right? If we have never plowed, we have never sprayed any killers, so no herbicide, pesticide, fungicide, right? And we've never put in any other fertilizer other than what obviously is dropping from the animals, right? So we've got the armor covered, we've got the continual plant covered, we've got the the minimal disturbance covered, and diversity, right? We're all excited about the three sisters, right? But there's probably 100 different species in this pasture right here, right? So we've got an amazing amount of biodiversity, and not just the biodiversity of plants, we also have multiple species. So we have a diversity of animals as well. So you can see in this picture here, we've got some layers in the front, we've got some sheep in the back, and we got something else going on in the far right there. So, and then of course, we've got animal integration, right? So in a sense, we're going above and beyond mitigation. We're going above and beyond all the, the criteria for soil health, right? And so in a sense, I kind of want to argue that if in our mind we think permaculture in a garden comes up, I would suggest maybe you would think maybe the measuring stick actually needs to be a pasture. That your permaculture garden needs to think and act a little bit like a pasture, simply because we never plow, we never add any any killers, and we've got an abundance of diversity with species. So what does that mean when we go through these things again, right? So if soil health from the principles, last one was from crops, and this one is from the perspective of grazing. Well, what's the focus? So the focus before was mitigation, right? Now, in a sense, we can go beyond mitigation, right? We're not so much worried about the damage we're causing. We think we can actually go beyond that because we know we're not causing damage, but we're actually going to move on into how much good can we make. So again, the same principles, liquid pathway carbon, the nexus of the soil building is the interactions at the rhizosphere. Rhizosphere is just the sphere where the roots are, right? So our focus now becomes making plants work. So we move over to armor, primitive mitigation. It's true, there are ways to manage a pasture where you can start actually causing damage. So I threw up continuous grazing and rooting, especially if you are on in brittle areas. Brittle simply means we don't have as much rain as we do around here. So we can just kind of overgraze, and we can actually get erosion that way. Or if you've got hogs and you're not putting rings in their noses and they stay in one place too long. So you can start ruining a pasture, but especially here in Virginia, it's very hard to actually take out that pasture. It's so resilient, and we have plenty of rain that even if you sort of hurt it, it just comes right back. But you definitely can, right? And that's huge. It's got the water damage. It's also got temperature damage, right? Typical, if you want just a very loose rule of thumb for grazing, you take half and leave half. And leaving that half provides that shield, provides that shelter, and it keeps the temperature of the soil at optimum. It can be 20 degrees cooler from the ambient temperature on top of the grass down to the soil, and then you can keep it in optimum the optimum parameters for a lot of growth, and you can just have this revved up so that it's growing like crazy, right? So I've switched this from continual plants to continual live roots, right? Because we just have plants, and there can be a distinction between having the plants and the roots, because if you have a lawn, in a sense, you have plants there all the time, you have all your armor. But when you're just constantly mowing it and mowing it and mowing it, you typically have this hard pan underneath. The roots haven't really gone very deep. You don't really have a mycorrhizal network going on. And so that's why I changed the focus from roots to plants, because you could have plants and not really be working them much, and the roots not really doing much. I also wanted to bring a little more attention to the mycorrhizal network here, because if there's one way to look at soils, and that is to see if on the spectrum of fungus versus bacteria. So if you have a forest, particularly a rainforest, it's almost 100% fungi. And basically the leaves fall down or the trees fall down, whatever, that fungus just gobbles it up, eats all that carbon. And there's not that much bacteria, so to speak. You have a pasture and you've got a mix, somewhere in the vicinity of 50-50. You've got bacteria going, but your roots are staying intact. You've got a permaculture going, and so you have the mycorrhizal network, you have a fair amount of fungi. When you have a garden or you're doing crops, you're always managing towards bacteria. You're always managing towards being 100% bacteria oriented. So, and that's just simply a function of pressures on the system, right? So let's just say you're really conscientious and you just plow once, right? So most people here around April, they plow just to get a clean slate right at the beginning. So they plow, and then after that, they may be really good, and they may just kind of cultivate the top inch. They just be very careful. But what you need to realize is that once you've disrupted that regime, once you've disrupted everything, you've got the bacteria can reproduce and just reestablish itself within weeks, or maybe just a week, especially in these wet temperatures that we have. So the bacteria get a hold right away. They start doing their thing and start reproducing, right? The mycorrhizal network is very different. It's much slower, right? We're talking about months. So maybe you've plowed just once, you've planted your stuff, and then you're going to do cover crops, and you're going to do a bunch of stuff. You're trying to deal with it really well. Well, 2-3 months later, now we're into June, going into July, you're just starting to get the mycorrhizal network going again. And maybe it gets kind of hot. Maybe July is kind of hot, so things slow down a little bit. So you really got some really good growth going on that for like August and September. By the time you get into October, November, it's going back into hibernation. It's going back to being dormant, right? So it's not working as much. Well, you do this the next year, and again, you set it back. So anytime you have this, anytime you got plowing, anytime you got this real serious disruption of the roots, you're always going to be managing towards 100% bacteria, right? And so you're missing out on some of the key functions and the key interactions that make soil. So let's move on. Here, I have, rather than minimal disturbance, I have appropriate disturbance. Because we know now that grasslands especially, and most all of nature, you can't not interact with it. Right, especially like if we're talking about the grasslands, we've already killed all the bison off. You know, there used to be 50, 60 million bison roaming around. They were interacting, you know, with all kinds of animals were doing that. Well, we no longer have that if we don't have the animals going there. So we kind of have to interact. So there's no such thing as just leaving it alone anymore, right? Because as bad as overgrazing is, undergrazing, it also will kill grasslands. So one of the things going on here is very mechanical, and that's the hoof disturbance. So especially in brittle environments where you don't have as much water as we do here, let's say the animals go through and they've eaten half and there's still some stubble sticking up, right? And you've got the plants or whatever's left is sticking up. And if it's dry, the bacteria are not going to go up there and decompose that, right? Because they need a wet and moist environment. So the animals that are going through are actually pushing down that residue so that it can get contact with the soil where the bacteria are and where the environment is moist enough for them to do their thing. Also, there's a lot of plants that need the seeds. So you need the seeds to be able to be pushed down in the hoofs so they have good contact with the soil. So there's a very physical component about that. But below is a much more complex system, right? So we get back to the roots, and this gets back to making the plants work. So when you're grazing, right, we think of our pasture as a solar panel, and it's got somewhere, let's say it's got 100 different species, and they're all catching light and all photosynthesizing at different ways, at different times, you know, and they're better at different, whether it's drier or cooler or hotter or whatever, they're all doing this thing and getting an amazing amount of energy, and it's pushing it down to the roots, right? And so you bring in your animals and you say, let's say you take half and you leave half, there is sort of a dieback there, right? So if most people know that if you take a chunk out of a plant or you harvest some of the plant up top, the roots are going to reflect some of that, right? So there's going to be some of that root's going to die back. You're not going to take it off too far, so you're not going to hurt the mycorrhizal network too much, so it's still intact, but there is going to be some of that root dying off. And that's actually the way the grasslands is an appropriate amount of stress, right? Because suddenly that root dies, and you have these cycles of life and death going on in the soil. So all these nutrients become available. So the microbes, the bacteria, the fungus, all the critters, all this are starting to eat this. Then you got predators coming in there, and they're eating some of these smaller microorganisms, and then they poop out, and they got nutrients there, and all this, suddenly it's an explosion of life. The plants themselves with the roots are suddenly, they've got plenty of reserve, so they're fine with this, but they realize, oh, we need to regrow our solar panel again. So they send more sugars down, they have plenty of reserve, they send it down, and they push out more exudates. They push out more sugar out of their roots. And this is like a stimulus package. So again, there's a whole other explosion of all this animal life, trillions upon trillions of tiny little microscopic living things, and they're all eating and dying and eating and dying, and there's this explosion. So there's this pulsing. So when you eat half, leave half, and then you let it grow back, and then you do it again, it ends up being much like muscle building. So it's an appropriate stress. And we know that within this, when you're working out, you gotta sort of stress things in order to build things. So we end up being, as a rotational grazier, a little bit more like a coach, right? So you're thinking, well, hey, you're not working hard. Let's work a little harder, get some more muscles, or hey, you're doing it too much, right? Maybe that's pushing the metaphor a little bit. But in a sense, this root dying back and pulsing of the grasslands is actually really good for the soil, just like muscle building. We're building with the roots. We're building with the interactions at the rhizosphere. So, and that just leads us right back into diversity. At this point, the diversity becomes self-explanatory, right? You just have more interactions for more and more species, and that's both that's both plant and animal. If you can get multiple species of animals, is there. So going down to the fifth principle, I switched this a little bit. Instead of having animal integration, I would argue that maybe we need to think more about having crop integration. Right? I went to the VABF conference when it was in Roanoke. I think that was like a year ago or something, or a year and a half ago. And I went to where these people are practicing it. I can't remember the guy's name right now. And I had written it down, but I don't know. Anyways, so he basically had his pasture, and he maintained and kept his pasture intact. And then maybe he would have his ruminants come along, and they would graze really low down and graze it really hard. And that would give him a chance to go in there and drill seeds in. So kind of like a no-till thing, and drill seeds in. And he was doing some serious cash crops, and serious cash crops for like food consumption, right? So he may be doing wheat, or he may be doing corn, right? And he would let that go through, and then after he'd harvest it, right, he would either maybe plant some cover crops, or maybe he would say, oh, I've a heavy feeder with corn, and we've really hurt the soil kind of bad. Let's bring in the ruminants, and let's condition this again. I've seen other things presented about pasture cropping, where they might have the ruminants and pasture, and they condition the soil and they condition the pasture for about 5 years with the animals. And then they'll do a 3-year rotation where they do like a cash crop, cover crop, cash crop. And then they'll go 5 years, and they believe that it took 5 years for the animals to recondition that soil to get things really functioning again, to the point that they weren't losing soil fertility. So I think actually that if we're going to get into if we're going to talk about sustainability, we're going to talk about regenerative agriculture, particularly if we're concerned with the soil, I think this is kind of the future, where we really need to think about incorporating all these things, and that the animals, particularly ruminants, can start being at the foundation of the soil and the soil fertility, and then the crops can be brought in. And I think, Lindsay, this would be a good time. I think I'm seeing some questions. I haven't looked at them, but this would be a good time to stop and do a little bit of question and answer.
Okay, we do have a couple questions. If you have too few animals on pasture, is it better to reduce the paddock size to fit the number of animals to the rotation? Or is it best to settle for less than appropriate disturbance across the entire pasture?
It's better to reduce the paddock size. Most people would agree with me on that are into this, that you need a certain amount of pressure. The appropriate disturbance is actually a mob, is actually fairly heavy. So you end up having sort of a threshold. So if you only have like 2 animals, it's a lot harder. But if you actually start having a herd, then you can actually treat them as a herd. And yeah, there's this very nice balance where, and this is where it's an art form, right? So you want to give them just a little bit of pressure so that they're taking a chunk out of everything. So like, not just eating their most favorite food, but they're actually eating a little bit of everything, but you don't want them to take too much. So there's just a fine little balance there. But usually the problem is that you're not bringing your animals in too tight. And so in general, there might be lots of exceptions to the rule, but in general, yeah, it would be better to reduce paddock size.
Okay, great. We have one more question from Jeff Walden, and he wants to know if you have any experience with Nrcs Conservation Practice 808, the soil health CP, and particularly the biochar component.
I don't, but I think I know what this is about. Things like biochar, things like trying to get carbon in that way, I still think of it as inputs. I still think of it as ingredients and very mechanical. I may not understand biochar really well, but I'd have to be convinced at how they're increasing plants to work, how they're enabling more plants to do more work. But it may have its place. Okay, all kinds of different environments, are going to have different needs, and some more brittle environments need more help than others. But I have a hard time seeing how that would be necessarily, particularly in our area here with the kind of rainfall we get.
Okay, we have one more question from Taylor and Drew. How do you rotationally graze year-round at your farm?
Well, we do differentiate between species a little bit there, right? So we actually bring our layers, our chickens, and we bring them into hoop houses, and so they're able to get in and get warm, and they also have access to outside. So it becomes more like a free range thing. And then that outside section kind of becomes like a sacrificial pit. So it gets pretty hairy, scary there after 3 months of them being on that soil. So the rest though, we only do broilers and meat birds during the warm season. So we bring our stocking rate way down in a sense. So, but we still have the sheep and we still have the hogs going through the winter. And same thing, when we haven't been able to stockpile enough grass, we stockpile a fair amount, but then we will supplement with hay, and then we'll just keep moving them through. Different people have different philosophies on this. Some people will just keep them in one place in the winter and kind of sacrifice that area. Others, like us, I enjoy sending them through in the winter when it's not. If there's ice, we don't move them. We just give them extra hay. But most of the time, we're still moving them, and then you keep spreading more manure and more hay, and there is a little bit of nutrients that become there as when the spring comes. There's kind of a flush, a little stimulus package from all that. So both the hogs and the sheep keep going all year round.
Okay, and one more for right now from Natasha Shannon. How does grazing management change in ecosystems with less rain that are maybe less resilient to stress? Is it as simple as less time spent on each piece of land?
Yeah, it's a matter of timing and regrowth, right? So so it gets very complex, right? So in brittle environments, the ruminants become even more essential because there's this feedback loop between the biome and the microbes and the bacteria in the soil, and there's an echo of that in their rumen, right? And if you think that the amount of species and the incredible diversity in the soil is amazing, the rumen is even more so. And basically, it's kind of a reflection of that. So in brittle environments, that manure drop and that fertilization is important. So you've got to have that tension. It's sort of a renoculation of these soils with a lot of bacteria. So there's a tension between getting enough of that manure and getting that reinoculation and not overstressing the grass, right? So typically, yes, it would be less time spent on it, so that it could recoup. and you just have to know how soon it's going to grow back. Now, this all changes whether you are in rainy season or dry season. My reference is in Africa, and there's times when there's so much rain, and it's just always raining, and everything's growing like crazy. Well, you can have massive impact and massive, just tons of biomass, and you can go a lot slower. When it's during the dry season, you're still going to need to impact that, but yeah, you'd have to have less time, same amount of species, so same amount of impact, but just less time, so that you're still just eating half the biomass, moving on and trampling all the rest in. That trampling and that manure that gets dropped in that sense then becomes even that much more potent, because the other systems are a little bit more brittle and they have a little hard time. I don't know, did that answer the question?
We have one more question from Tom Brody, if you're ready.
Sure.
Could you walk through the process of how you restore a couple acres used for previous cropland but fallow for 4 years to usable grazing pasture using cover cropping or pasture seed mix for building soil? And then when can you bring in the animals?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to save this question because I actually deal with something, and I'll try to remember to add a couple of those elements of that question in, because I'm going to deal with this when we talk about leveraging and general systems theory. So hold me to this, and hopefully I can answer this in the talk itself.
Okay, thanks. I'll leave it up. And Natasha says, yes, you did answer the question. Excellent. And then Micah has one more about when feeding hay, is it worth unrolling or otherwise distributing hay across pasture?
I imagine it would be. I don't actually use the big heavy round bales. I much more tighter control. So I'm just using, and I also have sheep. So the square bales are like higher nutrient. They keep their nutrient value a lot better. And the sheep need a little bit better hay than the cows do. So I don't work with the big big round bales. But yeah, that is one way. Go to the top of the hill, spread it down. That's usually for bigger groups and bigger areas, because I control tightly with my netting. If you could imagine unrolling in that picture right at the beginning, you wouldn't be able to unroll a big, huge bale in the section of that daily section. So yeah, I'm sure you could work it in there, but with as tight as we are, with as small operations we are, I don't even use the round bales. I use square bales.
Okay, great. That's all the questions we have for now.
Okay, so let's get to ramifications, implications. Might get a little bit controversial here, but I still have quite a bit I want to go through. So different paradigms, reductionistic versus interlocking systems, right? And I'm going to run through this a couple times. The first time is just so we get a sense of what I mean when I say these things. So reductionism, basically based on the scientific method. The scientific method is to see the world in terms of atoms, to see the world in terms of compartmentalization, to see the world in terms of individual ingredients. And the scientific method is to basically disconnect interactions, except for one. So you're always controlling. So a true scientific experiment controls for everything but one variable. So you're isolating the single variable, and you're isolating all the interactions except for one. You're trying to take them all out, right? So you're controlling for everything. So it's kind of the opposite of interactions. And very powerful, right? This is a very powerful way of interacting with the world. And we want to have this cause and effect from A causes B. And we know that because we've taken all the other variables out, right? And we've been able to do unbelievable technological things we do with this. The problem is that things are always connected, right? And so we've continually exported all the in a sense, we've turned a blind eye to a lot of the causal things here. And we pretty much have put all the if we have detrimental things, we put them on the backs of the poor, or we hurt the environment, right? And so the scientific method, as powerful as is, always needs to come with caveats, and it always needs to come with dire warnings that this isn't the real world. And if we try to mold the world this way, we got to be careful of undesirable cause and effect that we haven't seen in the lab, right? So it's concerned about single variables. It's concerned about controlling for that, right? So you see the world as just a bunch of parts, an aggregate of parts together. You see them as ingredients. You see it as a recipe. We just put things together and, you know, like a Lego, and there you go. That's that thing. So production then in that context, very factory oriented, becomes about maximum production, right? We just, we've shrunk things down to this one variable, and we just want to get the most out of it that we can. That means we're looking for a linear efficiency, right? If you have anyone who's been interested in what they call the third industrial revolution, they're all about, right, the aggregate efficiency. You're trying to get rid of waste. You're trying to do things so that you can get from A to B and then maybe from B to C, but in each interaction there, you just want only that one thing to happen. You don't want any waste, right? So they're like, well, if we can, and this is how they say this is an answer to the environment. If we mitigate damage and we mitigate all this waste, we're only going to use what we need and we'll have no waste. We'll get from A to B and then we'll be efficient, and that's going to save us from causing harm to environment. Well, we'll swing back around these all over again. What happens though is that you get an affinity for scalable technology, right? So you've got you want to get into technology and you want to get big, right? So as you want your machines, like if you're going to buy these machines, you want to do more and more because you have these machines, right? And you're talking about speed and specializations, right? So this is where you get the lean, the factory lean. And this is because we're doing exactly the same thing of the scientific method, isolating for single variables, but now you're not talking about ingredients, you're talking about actions. You're talking about a task. So you're isolating a task, right? So this is classic assembly line, right? And the best thing for this is a robot. So like you're on assembly line and you got, say you want to take this screw and you bring it over to here and you screw it in, and then you reach over here and you do that same motion over and over. And technology shines in this, right? Stick a human in there, and by the 500 reps of this, not only are you going mentally berserk, but you probably have carpal tunnel syndrome, and you have all kinds of issues, right? But the efficiency of the factory is you isolate single tasks, you isolate single actions, and then you just repeat that over and over. We'll swing back around this. I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page here, right? So ecology. Ecology is the direct opposite of this, right? Interlocking systems, right? So it's about the interaction of many, many systems, right? It's very messy. When you go out into the woods, it's nuts. When you get down into the weeds of your grasslands, it's pure chaos, right? But it's actually this sort of messy diplomacy, right? You end up with this dynamic equilibrium, right? You end up with these just all this homeostasis that happens with all these systems interaction, right? So they're all kind of vying a little bit, and sometimes they can get into a symbiotic relationship, sometimes not, but there's constantly all kinds of systems that are relating, right? So what becomes important with that is not trying to isolate individual variables and trying to find a cause and effect, but you're actually trying to focus on communication pathways. So you're trying to make sure that things can cycle, right? Whether you're talking about carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, water, nutrients, it's all about cycling, right? It's all about communication. Things don't just stay. It's the difference between balance and dynamic equilibrium, right? Our lungs aren't balanced, right? It's not like we have the proper amount of oxygen, the proper amount of carbon dioxide constantly, and we stay still. We have to breathe. We have to take it in and we have to push it out. And it causes this difference, right, of pressure. And that's what gets these things to move. So things are always pumping, they're always cycling, right? We got to get these communication pathways. So when you're concerned about ecology, you're concerned about communication pathways. In general systems theory, you call this feedback loops, right? And more than just, and that's related to communication pathways, because the feedback loops are oftentimes giving information back and forth so that you can keep that homeostasis. Production. Rather than maximum and the factory, we're talking about optimum, right? And I think I always think of the golden goose, right? So we have the story about the farmer, and you have this goose. I can't think of a more appropriate story we need for today. And that goose was giving an egg a day, an amazing amount of abundance, right? And of course, he got greedy and decided he wanted to cut it open so he could get all that gold. Of course, when he cut it open, there was no gold because it was the interactions, it was the system that was making the golden egg, right? I would just tweak that story just a hair, because I don't know if anyone has eviscerated a stewing hen, right? So when you open up a stewing hen, she, like most all animals, has her eggs from the very beginning, right? And so when you cut her open, there might even still be an egg in there. So it's just the last yolk that gets the shell around it. So maybe she's already plopped that egg out. What you have left there is a yolk that's almost the same size as a normal yolk. And then the next one's a little bit smaller, but still, significant. And then a little bit small, a little bit small, a little bit smaller. So you have thousands of these tiny little egg yolks. So in a sense, you can cut open the goose and actually get a little bit more. You can get a little bit more gold out of that goose from that extraction. And I think that's what we do when we focus on maximum, right? Rather than optimum, right? You're not, because we do get some they're diminishing returns, but we do get extra when we extract, when we take out fossil fuels, when we push the soil, when we add our nitrogen and all this. We might be destroying the systems for later for future abundance, but we can get a little more. So there is that sense where I think that's usually the temptation, and that's what gets us to do it, is that you can open it up and get a little bit more gold, but you won't have near the abundance if you had some restraint and you went for optimum rather than maximum. Efficiency becomes very different. You're interested in permaculture. You're interested in a long term rather than short term, right? And this is the entirely different concept of aggregate efficiency, because nature works with waste, right? Whatever we consider waste, nature takes that bit of waste, and she creates another biological loop. She creates another feedback loop. There's a little bit of waste there, and suddenly you have an animal that can move in and create a niche there, and it makes it more abundant, more diversity, right? Each time there's more diversity, there's more abundance, there's more soil building, and then there's room for more. So nature, the concept of waste is actually the pumping energy into the nature system. So we have to be very careful when we're talking about getting rid of waste or not, right? Messy, wasteful, and very redundant, right? Because when we have redundance, this is the exact opposite of affinity for scale, right? Right now we've got like 4 or 5 massive multinational corporations that are in control of seeds, of like 80% of seeds. Same thing happens with the processing of animals. It's like in the hands of 80%, it's like in the hands of 4 companies. It's ridiculous, right? We've got centralization, and then that way we can get efficiency. And then suddenly if one of those links falls apart, we're in trouble. And this is happening. We're still feeling the effects of this. We're feeling the effects of this with getting into the butchers. We're feeling the effects of this with the post office and getting chicks, right? Where nature, because she's wasteful and because she's got lots of different species doing very similar things, she's redundant. So if one of those species fails, then you got 5 more to come in there and take care of it. And so there's this redundancy built into the system because we're concerned about long term. So it's a very different concept than lean, right? And I'm not trying to, I know a lot of vegetable growers, JP and Sally were just talking about lean, and I'm not trying to, diss on them, or I'm not trying to, be mean or anything. I just want us to recognize that those principles, right? Like Ben Hartman wants us to produce well. He wants us to be real players in the game, and I get that. And there's a certain amount, if you're going to be an operation and you're going to be a business, you do have to have that sort of efficiency. I just want us to remember that these need to be subservient to ecology, that these need to be secondary, and that they always are going to push against nature. They are not natural. They are much more like the scientific method, and they bring a method, and they bring their own dangers. So I'm just, in a sense, raising a red flag with all the emphasis on lean these days. That's actually not nature. We just need to remember that, all those things always come with dangers, right? And I have this word holistic. I know it's overused, but I think that gives the idea that all these things are interplay. Even the efficiency of the scientific needs to be just one player within all these other variables that are having this, if you're talking about a farm and an operation, you've got all sorts of considerations. One is making money, true. One is the soil. One is the animal health. One is how good it tastes. One is, all these different things. And the efficiency is just one ingredient among the others that are just kind of vying, and one system that's just kind of vying for a little bit of space and trying to find homeostasis in your operation. So let's swing through this really quick again. I want to have time for questions afterwards. So reductionistic, right? Crops and grains and vegetables, right? I also am throwing CAFOs. It's just basic confinement animal feeding operations. So this is basically your animal monocrops, right? So scientific method, again, you're always managing towards monocrops. It's just simply what vegetables and crops have to do, right? Because you are entering to the systems at that granular level. You're entering it into the ingredient level. Because if you say, oh, I'm going to grow tomatoes for a restaurant, and then you plant half an acre of tomatoes, you're not going to just intersperse that with all these things, right? You're going to put them all together, and you're just going to grow your tomatoes in that half acre. That is just the nature of the beast, right? And it's because we're entering into the system at that ingredients level. We're entering into the system at that compartmentalized resolution, right? So at the single variables, that's just part of the game. So we always have to be careful. There's always going to be that pressure within that kind of system to go towards monocrops, right? And if you're talking about animals, it's cages, right? They're throwing birds in cages, they're throwing hogs in cages. It's god awful, right? So aggregate of parts, right? It's you got your tomatoes. We got to think, okay, we got to have tomatoes, and then we have to have an acre of cucumbers, and then So production, factory maximum. It's always going to push. If lean becomes the most important thing, you're always going to have technology and automation, right? And you're always going to conform your plants to uniformity. Basically, what I mean is, right? So if you've got technology and you've just bought a thresher for $50,000, right? You actually are you're going to do your best to take out all the variables. You're going to do your best to take out all the variety and all the diversity. Because if let's say we're growing corn, right? We want it all the same age. We want it all the same species, so that we can bring in this mechanical thing that comes in and takes the corn heads and throws them this way and leaves the other stuff that way, right? And so we always, whenever technology and automation are the name of the game, then we're going to conform our plants in order to be monocrops. We're going to conform them to have the least amount of diversity, least amounts of variability. So it's just a red flag. Let's be careful. Linear efficiency, right? Again, I think I went through this, fewer and larger systems. You're always going to have this pressure to scale and to have fewer and larger systems, because when you have technology, that robot just doing that one motion over and over and over, you're going to want it to do it as much as it can, right? There's no sense of needing a different task for it. It takes time to reprogram it to do something else. It takes time, if it's not being used, we feel like it's being wasteful. So there's always going to be this pressure between fewer and larger systems. So lean and specialization. All right, I'm going to keep moving here because I want to get to some good questions and answers. So rotational grazing. We're entering it at a very different resolution of the systems, right? Ecology. We're trying to mimic nature. So, right, we used to have 60 million bison, elk, pronghorn, caribou, massive herds. And right, and we know what they did. We know how they built the soil in our grassland. So we're just trying to mimic that, and we're controlling that with those nettings. So we're using our technology, sure, our nets, and we're trying to do a small little microcosm of that, right? And it's about all these different interactions on that. Communication pathways, feedback loops, right? So the most obvious of this is manure, right? When the ruminant drops its manure, it's full of bacteria, it's full of microbes, and that actually communicates with the soil. In more brittle environments, that's actually essential. When you're in Africa and it's been dry for 3-4 months, and then you got the rain coming back and you got a little flush of grass, they come back to eat that. They're actually re-inoculating it with anything it's missed, with anything that's died over the dry season. That manure is so important to keep that soil as diverse and as functioning as it normally does. So there's always this, always this communication going on, right? And manure is called by most people waste, especially when it's dealing with humans, right? We call it waste. But from nature's point of view, it's just feeding another whole bunch of different systems. It's a way of having more and more biological systems to get more and more diversity. So take half, leave half. That's basically, when you got your solar panel revving and you take half, leave half, it's got enough of it to build back up, and it just amazing amount of biomass, right? So we can have a field at our place. We may send throughout the year, we may send our sheep through maybe 3 times, right? And then we may have sent our layers through once, maybe our broilers. We might even get some hogs through a couple times. And then maybe one of those fields, instead of that, we're doing some haying. Right, but you are basically, there's some restraint, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too. You see all that grass and you're like, oh, let's just have them clean it all up. But no, you have some restraint. You only take half. That means it's going to rebound faster. And people think, well, if I do it right now, I'm going to get that little extra bit, but that's the diminishing return. If I leave half, then twice as fast, it's going to regrow the biomass so I can bring back more animals and come through there again. So restrained and optimum. Long-term efficiency, messy, wasteful, redundant, resilience. We're gonna go back through this with another slide very similar. It's gonna be my last slide, I promise, but I'm gonna just talk about a little bit more of the ramifications. So I think of this in general systems theory, you talk about strategic points of entry. Right? If we're in the reductionist system and the typical thing is like when you want to plant something, you want to get into a crop production, what's the first thing you do? Everyone tells you, take a soil test. Measure, 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 right? We got to know what's in your soil so we can know what to add to it, what you're going to plant, what's good for it, right? And this is where I'm going to get a little controversial, but I actually think this is very, very detrimental to soil health, because it can be very destructive, right? We're looking at it and we want to measure all the different ingredients, right? And rather than what's already there and what's already working, right? And we'll swing back to this one more time after this. Yeah, okay. Trying to figure out what to keep in here, because I really do want to have questions. Right, so we have the granular resolutions. We're focusing on individual parts, right? We want to know what nitrogen is there, what's available phosphorus. We want to know all these things. We're focused on quantities, right? So inputs, right? So basically what a soil test is going to do, it's going to tell you this is what you have available, and this is what you need. You're going to have to get some of this and put some of that, put some of that. Well, the problem is all this available, bioavailable nutrients, plants, it's about 10%. That's about 10% of what the plants need to be using, right? In a healthy system, 90%, somewhere around there, of the nutrients that they get needs to happen through interactions. Not only does that keep diversity, not only does that keep the plant healthy, not only does that keep that Brix level really high, that sugar level high, but it also builds soil, right? And so if our first understanding and our first sort of instinct is to do a soil test, we actually start focusing on the part that does not do interactions, right? This needs to be done later on when we're trying to figure out why we're having a problem we can't get somewhere, rather than starting with it, right? Because what happens when we start focusing on inputs? And I'm not just talking about synthetic fertilizers or synthetic, I'm talking also about organic, right? So if we're talking about Mycorrhizal Network, one of the most famous, most studied part of this thing is that they get phosphorus in exchange for carbon, right? Phosphorus is one of those things that's very unstable, right? It always wants to connect with something and get stuck with it, and it's not very available for the plants, right? So we tend to want to give phosphorus. Well, that's the job of the mycorrhizal network, right? And so what happens if you start putting nitrogen in, or if you start putting phosphorus in, or whatever, potash, or any of these other things, right? Without first knowing whether the systems are there and can do it on their own, well, it's basically like bringing in Walmart right next to a mom and pop, right? It's free. It's like super, super cheap, right? And the plants can just absorb it, and they're going to be like any other customer. They're going to be like any other, like thrifty person. They're going to take what's free rather than exchange the carbon to the mycorrhizal network, right? So mom and pop can't compete with Walmart, and so they're just going to die off. And that's what happens not just to the mycorrhizal network, but it happens to the bacteria, it happens to the microbes, it happens to the whole host of living organisms down there. So basically you're imploding the economy, and you're creating dependency. You're creating a very just destructive dependency, and you're going to be more and more inputs. So it's always a danger when we sit there and we have, okay, let's figure out what our soil is and what's our ingredients, rather than seeing that as a tool of when we're in trouble, how do we figure out what's wrong? On the other side, we have integrated systems. So we're looking at this at a very different, broader resolution, right? I'm going to give two examples for this, right? So if you've got your tomatoes and you've got, or whatever, cucumbers, whatever you got, and you've got something that goes wrong with them, right? You've got blight, or you've got a pest, or you've got Japanese beetles, whatever it is, you have made a commitment that you're going to get these tomatoes to the restaurant or to the market or whatever, right? You got to take care of them. You got to add that pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, whatever you need to do to keep that, and you're going to try to do the least amount of damage, but you have entered, your point of entry was at that granular level. You have to save that plant in order to meet your business needs. That's not so with the pasture, right? Our strategic point of entry now has become the system. So let's say Japanese beetles have gone crazy. They decided to kill all the white clover. I don't know, something out there, and they just going after this. Am I going to go out there and try to capture Japanese beetles and spray or capture? No, because I'm not worried about it, because that's not my point of entry, right? Let's say that white clover gets hit hard. It may even die that year. If I got 100 species out there, there's going to be 5, 8, 10 species that are going to come in there, and they're going to fill that niche. And I'm not going to have to, I'm going to let those systems in nature kind of work itself out. And if I have enough resilience, then hey, I don't even have to worry about it. Now, maybe if I was into a more brittle environment, I have to be a little bit more careful. I'd have to consider. But at this point, with as resilient and as abundant as our systems are here, we don't have to actually worry about it, right? Another example of the granular resolution versus the broad resolution. I just finished reading the book by Vandana Shiva, The Oneness versus the 1%. And she has long been crusading against GMOs. GMOs have a history of intellectual property that has gone in and utterly decimated India's economy. They've utterly just oppressed the poor. They have sent vast rural communities into depression, both economically and psychologically. People are committing suicide, right? So Vandana Shiva has been fighting these monsters for a long time. And that is like, it's one of the worst things out there. But it's very interesting to me. What caught my attention was she went after the mechanics as well. She said, this is because of the paradigm that they're working under. So they go in with CRISPR, and they go in there and they slice a single little DNA and they switch it for whatever it needs to be so that it's glyphosate resistant or whatever it is. And her response is like, my God, what are you doing, right? So like, you are just opening your world to Pandora's box, because nothing works in isolation. That's the lab, right? So they go in there and they slice one little DNA. She says, we've known this forever, right? That genes work in guilds, they work in groups, right? So if you activate one, you're activating maybe 30 others. You don't know. Nothing. These things don't happen in isolation. That gene theory is back from the 1800s. We need to throw that away. Even if our technology is 21st, 22nd century, right? We need to have the right paradigm, because we're going in there, we're doing all this damage. So genes themselves work in a community. And then on top of that, there's also epigenetic. So genes work with their environment, and genes in their environment, typically in our bodies, has to do with the kind of nutrients you get. So if you're getting plenty of vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin C, you're going to be able to turn on certain groups of genes so that they function well, right? And then you can broaden that out to larger, right? You have the environment that affects your nutrients, broader and broader, circles of all these systems interacting. And Vandana Shiva is like, the reason why this never works, and these crops always end up fail, whether, cotton was the big thing in India, but whether it's the other, they always end up failing, because we can't wrap our minds around the systems. We're just changing individual granular resolution. We're changing individual ingredients, individual parts. Whereas she says, we know how to breed animals and plants, right? And we always know that when we breed, there's a give and take. Right? If you always breed for size, you're going to start suffering maybe health-wise. You might suffer for how good moms they are, right? They might not be as parasite resistant, right? So you're trying to get prolific and healthy, but as well as, good, meat to bone carcass. But it's all this sort of dynamic equilibrium that's happened. All these different ingredients and stuff aren't just Lego pieces, but they're things that interact. Same thing with plants, right? So we enter it not at the individual level, but we enter it at the final level where we see the final product. We take measurements after the ewe has had her lambs. Did she have 2? Did she raise them out? Are they healthy? Are they parasite resistant? And then we make her decision on that. And we don't go into the individual gene. Okay. I'm going to keep moving on here. So we focus on interactions. We have a very different strategic point of entry when we're dealing with ecology. And quality needs to precede quantity. We're not focused on the quantities. Feedback loops, systems as entry points, leverages, right? So if you're talking about general systems, you talk about leverages. And hopefully I can answer Tom's question here, right? So we got a new land, and it had horses on for years and years. And we were able to acquire this land and finally get those horses off. And the systems had just come down and just sort of slowed down to just about nothing, right? It was like worse than a lawn in some ways, right? Because horses, there was just a few horses on there, but they can do incredible amount of destruction if they're just continually grazing. Right, so my idea was get the horses off, let it grow some there, and then I'll do my rotational grazing with the ruminants, with the sheep, but it wasn't growing much at all. I mean, the grass was getting like 4 or 5 inches, and I really have to have enough biomass to be able to bring my ruminants in there. So what's my leverage point? I could go in there and I could plant all sorts of things, or I could put fertilizer, or I could put, I could do all these things that, the soil test is going to say I need to do, or I can leverage it through a species. So when I think of inputs, I actually have a way of putting inputs, but I put it through an animal. So we send our chickens through, right? And this is one of our chickens and our hogs, our poultry and our hogs, actually, they can't be 100% grass fed. So we do bring in grain and we feed them grain. So they eat tons of grass, but they're also getting tons of feed. So, but that feed goes through the system of their guts, of this special biological niche, crazy system of nature that goes through the guts of this bird and drops all this manure. And many people are like, oh, chicken have such bad conversion rates. You have to feed them 3 or 4 pounds of food for them to get 1 pound of protein. They're just wasteful animals. Well, from this perspective, they're not. They're turning that waste and that fertilization into something that I didn't study what that soil needed. I don't know what that soil needed, but I know that this system has been working for a millennium. That fertilizer dropped onto the grass, And suddenly there was an explosion, right? We sent the poultry in a couple times, and then suddenly there was enough biomass we could start really conditioning the ruminants. So there was a way, and the thing is, the seed bank is still there, especially in these resilient areas that we have, right? I didn't have to plant any seeds, and suddenly the diversity of species popped back up. And now that field, after like 5 years, is like one of the most prolific in terms of biomass, one of our most prolific fields, right? And they have examples of doing this sort of proper management of pastures where suddenly seeds of, that they hadn't recorded for like over 100 years are now starting to pop back up. It's there, it's waiting, it's just waiting for the right, proper, optimum thing, proper management. They're waiting for some TLC, and all of a sudden these native species are all sprouting back up, right? Now that's us, we're in a resilient environment. So to get back to Tom's question, there may be places where you need a lot more, you asked to actually put a little bit more pieces in there because we don't have quite the rain, or we don't have quite the, in a more brittle environment, you just have maybe you have a lot of erosions, right? You have places like China that utterly decimated an entire area. They ended up bringing bulldozers and making steps so that you would have flat land, right? They do basically massive contours, right? You might have to do some more of these steps if you're in a more brittle environment, so you have less runoff mechanically, right? And then you can get some plants established, and then you can get the systems flowing. But that always has to be subservient to the systems that are there so we can make the plants work, because that's ultimately where the health comes in. Where we are now, we really don't need that, right? Our pastures, even if they've been continually grazed for decades, they're just waiting. The foundation is there, and they're just waiting. They're waiting to be revived again. So our leverage point there was a system. Our leverage point there was to put inputs through a chicken. So we're using our animals to make plants work. We need to get to some questions here. So I just had a few things. I thought, on the left-hand side, we have some hubris, some knowledge. We want to be in control, maybe. Like we have to always be careful of what's motivating us over there. When you're at the integrated systems, there's a lot of unknown, right? There's a lot of unknown, and you just have to trust nature oftentimes. And then you become participation. You try to become part of the symbiotic abundance of it. So wrap up, I guess. Animals are key, and the beautiful thing about doing rotational grazing is that we can enter into soil health and nature at a very appropriate strategic point of entry. And we're not nearly as dependent. In fact, I've never had a soil test. I rarely ever have a vet out. It's only when I have really problems that we're going to get a necropsy or get a test for our feed or something like that, right? And it's really a blessing to be able to just enter into this abundance at the systems level, where we don't have to actually know all this other stuff that takes microscopic eyes, things that I can't do with my own naked eye, and come at it from an artistic level in a sense. And I'm not trying to demean in any way. I got lots of friends that are growing vegetables and doing well, and they're using lean, techniques and trying to make their farms very production and also taking care of the soil, and they're doing a great job. But my focus on saying we got to recognize that is part of, that's factory orientation, that's technology orientation, and that's always going to give us pressures towards things that are antithetical or inimical into ecology. So I'm going to stop there because I've been talking quite long, and I do want to have time for questions and answers. And I would love, even if people don't necessarily want to write, if it's too long of a question, they could even maybe raise their hand and ask.
Thanks, Cedric. Yeah, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question directly or have a discussion, feel free to do that. I will go ahead and ask this one question in the chat. As it stands, revenue maximization is the goal of most businesses, especially farms and agribusinesses. How do you balance the practical need aspects of needing to make money to cover your personal and business needs and be considered as a legitimate business while maintaining your ecological principles?
Okay, the first thing I would say there is that we know that the systems that are doing that and prioritizing economy and making a living aren't doing it. It's not working, right? They are propped up by the largest welfare system in the entire world, and that is the subsidies of the U.S., USDA, right? So it isn't working, right? Because they've already used up their diminishing returns, and now they're dependent on handouts from the government to constantly prop them up, to make them productive. And they're giving subsidies, they're giving guarantees for all kinds of stuff, right? So the question no longer is how do we not be like, do we have to be like them in order to make money? It's like, we know that doesn't work, right? So it may be hard to make money in other ways, but we have to find different ways. And I am arguing that if we could maybe even if we can hold out long enough for that optimum to kick in and to get, more and more fertility, more that actually there's enough people that are making this truly a viable system that when you are doing regenerative agriculture that is, is emphasizing the soil health, they're actually able to make money and to make it for the long term. Does that help?
That's the only question I have there. Jim says yes, that does answer his question. And I don't see any other ones right now. Does anybody else have more questions, or do you want to raise your hand to speak?
I think Tom raised his hand. Did I answer your question, Tom? Yeah, nice.
He said yes, you did.
Yeah, cool. Well,
anyone else?
Well, good. Maybe I presented so well. There was no questions. Wasn't even controversial.
Oh, Tom is raising his hand here. Okay, go ahead, Tom. You're unmuted. Or actually, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, this is cool. It's a lot to talk about, so I don't know, in terms of you answering my question, no, I'm going to reiterate again, the need for me, like if I was to go restore a piece of pasture that was cropland, if I want to get animals on it, I can't get animals on it now because there's nothing for them to graze.
Yes.
So the process for me to build that back up into a grazing pasture, not hay so much, but I mean just more pasture, because it'll benefit the ground by having pasture animals on it versus making hay, etc. So I have a process to go through where the land has been laid fallow for 4 years and it needs total restoration. So
okay, so you're really sort of dealing with very abused land.
I would say overcropped, yes. I mean, I don't know if it was abused, but it just been worked for years and years, I'm not saying abused, but I'm just saying, yes, it was used. Like most of the land in Floyd, as you know, has been used. So cropping or pasturing. So that's what I'm saying. I have soil tests. I went the scientific way and got soil tests, but I can't translate what they mean. And it doesn't make sense. So I'll ask a local guy. I said, he's a grazer, livestock farmer. I said, how do I get this old back into pasture? You plow it, you disc it, you seed it, you cultipack it, and you hopefully it rains. That's what you do. He says, and you get it all in.
Who you should talk to is Larry Bright, because that's the situation he was in some 20 years ago when he bought his land. It had been way overcropped, had been done corn and all this stuff, and it wasn't growing anything. So he actually did have to plant and puts the seeds in and get a little bit of just grasses and biomass going. And then he started working with very few ruminants and poultry. And that's the way he revived his land. And now he's got unbelievable amount of fertility. But he started from very, very abused land.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. And he's, what is his farm operation called?
It's just the Bright Farm. So yeah, he's, right now he does 100% grass-fed beef. He does hogs, and he used to do poultry. He doesn't do the poultry anymore.
Okay, so yeah, that would be helpful. I mean, just to see how everybody, I've seen it done around here where they'll take, pasture land and actually turn it to hay ground. So that's, I guess you can go either way.
Well, hay
Or
is not quite the same thing as putting animals on it.
That's for sure. And I mean, if you really want to restore the soil, you're going to want to get it into that biomass production so you could put animals on it, which would really restore your soil health. Am I correct?
I agree.
Okay,
Yes.
good. And it's a process. So how many years will it take, do you think, to, and would it be better to just do that rather than keep cropping it? Let's say, it's, yeah. So
5 years is usually what you think of where you can get it to really good production.
Okay.
And that's when you see the most explosive changes, is in that first 5 years.
Okay, good. And then do you see, after that period of time, or anywhere between that 5-year period, when do you start putting your animals on it? When you're grassing?
I would put my poultry as soon as I got any kind of grass growing.
Okay, so that would be the first.
As soon as you can.
Poultry would be better than a ruminant.
Yes, because you're putting in nutrients. The ruminants have to get in there once there's enough of the systems functioning, once there's enough biomass to get this functioning, right? Whereas your poultry, they'll be eating that grass, but they're also being supplemented with grain. And so you're actually putting inputs in, you're putting nutrients into your system. You're basically giving it a stimulus package.
So do you think if I seeded that particular piece of ground in, let's say, the middle of this month, if I'm lucky and it all goes well, I can have grass growing by mid-June or starting up, and then follow that up with some turkeys and let the turkeys run through there for the season?
Yeah, as long as you're careful, let them eat half, take half, leave half, and move them on, keep them moving, and let it regrow back, right? Get those plants working. The more they work, the more interactions, the more soil, the more they'll be able to work later.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so it really takes a lot of timing. Everything is based on working with nature and the timing involved, right?
Yep, there's a lot of labor.
Yeah, right.
Love, labor of love.
Well, I'm 69, so I don't have a whole lot of labor left to do.
We'll get the animals to work it for you.
Yes, let's get the animals doing it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I could ask a bunch more questions, but you live around the corner, so we can talk sometime.
Yeah, we'll talk. Sounds good.
Maybe I can get you to help me, and you can run some turkeys on this thing.
Yeah, we'll talk.
You gotta expand. You know what I'm saying? Rotational grazing. You have a mobile turkey trailer that you can move them around from pasture to pasture. With turkeys, you have to herd the turkeys around.
I do, but they're not on wheels; they're on skids.
Oh.
We'll talk, Tom. We'll talk.
Okay. Later. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Micah has a question, and I just asked him to unmute. Should be good to go, Micah.
Yeah, see if that works.
Yeah. Hey, Micah.
Hey. soil sampling as a reductionist approach, you know, I know you're saying that in the context of pastures. Would you say that your intuition there extends to, for example, perennial crops, soil sampling before establishing an apple orchard?
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna be out of my area of expertise, so I'm glad you put it in terms of intuition. My intuition is yes, especially if you know that these things grow here well. If you know that they grow in this area, I'm always reluctant to think that I know better than nature. Right? You know, you might want to just take very general, like pH and things, you know, carbon, or, you know, you get some general things. And I'm not saying soil tests are bad in that sense, but just like it needs to be a very loose sort of parameters so that you're not sitting there thinking that you know best and that you know you need to add things in. We grow apples here, they grow on their own and they grow great. And some of them are like 60 years old and I didn't plant any of them. Right. So I know apples work. So I would, you know, I don't know, you know, maybe, yeah, probably not the right person to ask, but I would just maybe throw a little bit of compost in there to help it get started right at the beginning. But I wouldn't be too worried until you run into problems and then figure this stuff out. Right. I know a friend who wanted to grow blueberries, and it turned out his pH around here was unusually basic. So he decided he was going to acidify his soil so he could grow blueberries. Well, it was a losing battle.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah.